Anyone? Thank you. We're gonna go all the our meetings. Not. Oh, later.
No, it's locked.
Yeah, so we passed over.
No, you guys.
Okay, I'm going to do this.
Yeah.
I think in the absence of our co-chairs, we'll go ahead and call this meeting to order. And for those of you who want to know why we chose this room, we do have some of our presenters are going to be in Zoom. This room is a little bit better set up from the tech perspective and sound. So if you have questions, they'll be able to hear. The second part is going to be very discussion based. And so with that, in the more formal sense, I will call this meeting to order on behalf of the task force. And so to begin, I'd like to ask Amy to call today's roll, please.
Dr. Stephen Lawrence.
Here.
Melissa Gudo. Representative Stephanie Hilferty. Ruth Lawson.
Paula Polito as proxy.
Senator Beth Mizell. Jan Moeller.
Here.
Stephen Procopio. Dr. Libby Saunier. Here. Michael Tipton.
Here.
So I'm gonna look at Vicky. So and Representative Freiberg, you said you were.
I'll do proxy for Stephanie. Can I do that? I just told you, or does she have to?
In a perfect world, this is in a formal, in a perfect world, we'll gladly welcome you to the meeting.
Yes, yeah.
Libby and I have rounded up forum fairly quickly.
I think there's no, so I am, as you all know, I'm a few months into the department. Now, department, your view on proxies, I think they do not count. It's one of the biggest challenges. So I think in the uniqueness of today, we do not have a quorum, but we do have a robust presence with proxies. So we'll essentially, in the sense of official meeting businesses, adjourn to a degree, but continue to convene for informational purposes. And so with that said, short one member of quorum, if anyone does come, we'll short two. Okay, all right, okay. Each moment I'm getting a little bit more information. So with that said, your next, we don't have any minutes to approve since we last time held discussion, but we'll continue to go forward in the same manner from the perspective of, I think we have enough individuals to still have a robust discussion to a degree for informational purposes. And so with that, today we're going to do, we're starting at 9 a.m. One, because we recognize it's Friday, some of you may have some afternoon plans and other obligations. We're going to spend about an hour and a half talking exclusively about funding. We'll kind of defer to the group if you feel like the appetite for a break before transitioning, or if you're like, well, it's Friday, let's keep going. The second part will be talking about the commission report, which is due in September of 2024. And so this group, being a smaller group, can kind of weigh in on the direction of the report. Okay, good morning. I'm sorry, I'm late. It's not it. We're still on site, but we're so happy. Yes, thank you for coming. Sorry, I don't know. Yes. Before I transition over for us to talk about funding and design removal, I did want to recognize you are live streaming. And so we do have a few that will be speaking via Zoom. So just being cognizant of volume. I hope that those who are joining us via Zoom can kind of let us know when you can't hear us. And so with that, we're going to kind of dive right on in to keep us on schedule. And thank you for the public that are also joining in on this dialogue. So with that, I'll kind of transfer over. Katie is joining via Zoom.
Yes.
So Abby McCartney and Katie Reed from Acton Partners are going to lead today's discussion on design principles. I know you have led previous discussion, and so this is kind of a follow-up of a previous one. So with that said, I'll sit over to Abby.
Wonderful. And the report from Katie is the audio sounds good. So thumbs up on the Zoom so far. So for those who haven't met yet, my name is Abby McCartney. I am the Senior Director at Acton Partners, working on issues related to funding and governance in early childhood. That's our wheelhouse. So very happy to be with you all to follow up on the discussion that we had last time. And also personally happy to be here because I started my career as a teacher in Jefferson Parish. So I love to be back in Louisiana. So I think we're going to start where it says infant toddler funding design. Unless we're going to take a minute to review back over task force or commission goals, but I think it's probably pretty well versed in those. Amazing, all right, cool.
Thank you.
Great, so for this part of our discussion, we'll start with a little bit of framing. Some takeaways from our last discussion in February. I know some folks were part of that, some folks may not have been there. We wanted to share kind of our emerging framework as we're thinking about funding design, and thinking about funding formula and all of those pieces, like what are the things that are most important that are coming out of the discussions that we're having. And then we'll spend most of our time in conversation really about the local role in this, because that's something that came up in our conversation last time that we didn't have time to sort of unpack and tease apart as much as we wanted to. So we broke that into two pieces. What's the funding contribution role for localities, and then what's the sort of governance and management role? And we'll talk more about those pieces. So hoping to spend most of our time there. Then, you know, look ahead a little bit to other things that are coming up. So our goals today are to continue to align on emerging principles for funding design in early childhood, and envision a fair and meaningful local role in funding and governance. And at this time, we're inviting you all to kind of approach this with an attitude of curiosity and opportunity and visioning of like, where do we want to go long term? We're very well aware that these are things that are not necessarily short-term undertakings, right? They are sort of big picture structural pieces that are not easy to do overnight. But we also feel like it's important to have a North Star of where you're trying to go so that the short-term movements move closer to that. And then also knowing that there are real challenges and limitations, and we want to surface those as well. But we want to try to do both at the same time. So the goals of the project that we've been working on with this group for the last few months, 6 months maybe, are to, which this group helped us to form, are to develop a funding design for Louisiana's early childhood care and education system that ensures access to high quality care and education and supports economic development in areas with the most need, distributes funding transparently in a way that's understandable, and improves quality, access, and sustainability by providing more stable resources for providers and the families that they serve. I think really for this conversation, the phrase I would circle is areas with the most need, because I think this is a place where, as we talk about local role, that looks really different across the state in different areas, and thinking about how we design something that works across those different contexts. And I'll give folks a minute to just look over these guiding principles, commitments for how we'll go about the work. I think another one to circle here would be embracing innovation while being actionable and realistic. It's a very tough balance always, but particularly when we're thinking about something so big picture and long term, how do we think about what we want to see, what we're hoping to see, while also thinking about what are the steps we can take in the short term to move us in that direction. When we talk about funding design, we're talking about both how you decide where money goes, the allocation of it, how do you decide who gets what, and also the distribution of it. How does it actually flow from the state to the people receiving it, the people who need it. And we talked about that. We unpacked those concepts in the February meeting. And just to share back a few of the key takeaways. First, just want to thank you all for enthusiasm and engagement for this project. We had a really great virtual discussion, and I know it's hard to prioritize these kind of abstract discussions when there's so much on your plate. So really appreciate you all engaging. We got feedback about making sure that we're considering adequacy, making sure that funds are adequate to cover the true cost of providing services, including cost of quality, including the cost of serving students with special needs or other significant challenges. Targeting limited funds to communities with most need. Considering at the community level, actually create supply and access where they don't exist. So maybe there's a different strategy for childcare deserts versus areas that already have more sufficient numbers of slots. Incentivizing local investment, as I mentioned, that's going to be a place where we spend a lot of time today. And what we did at the last meeting was really go through the structure of the MFP and talk about what works for early childhood and what doesn't. You'll see that on a future slide that's in here somewhere. But generally the feedback was there's a lot about this that works. there's a lot about this that might need to look different for ECE, and so we started to kind of think about what those were. And local contributions was a place where there was sort of a big question mark. How this works in the MFP might be a different. Are there any other things that folks would want to add or questions about the discussion? That's fine.
Chime in with a quick question.
Yeah.
The draft guiding principles, the first one, and you emphasize areas of the most need. And I guess, are we referring to needs specifically of needs within the childcare context? Or are we setting this up as a broad guiding principle to target energy in areas that generally have the most need? Just point of clarification.
Yeah, it's a good question for the group. My understanding from our discussions was that it was a more general conversation about where the kids and families with the most need are, and being able to target limit resources to those areas, which sometimes overlaps with where the childcare need is, but not always. Sometimes those are communities that are that actually have a lot of like Head Start seats or those kind of things already. So maybe a both and, but I'm curious what other folks think.
I think my instinct would be to keep it more targeted, just so that to bring greater focus to this discussion in this context, but
Yeah.
I don't know that we end up in a radically different place if we think of it different ways. I just thought.
I think it's a good point because it's part of the conversation we've had about not disincentivizing locals that are raising dollars, and they have more ability to do so versus other areas that just they might not have the revenue to bring local dollars into the game to serve more children too.
Very relevant for this competition today. Yeah. Slot need and kid need and community need, economic need might all be just different places, right? So how we define that might actually be an important component of how we think about targeting. So this very busy next slide kind of tries to summarize the things that we're hearing as we move through this process. But from you all, from the writers we talked to, from our LDME friends, and this is sort of like, I would say this is kind of like where we're trending in terms of recommendations. I think of this as kind of the middle layer between, like, last time we talked about some sort of overarching principles of funding design. So adequacy, stability, aligning funds across programs, targeting to the areas of most need. Those are kind of the big picture. And then like somewhere down the road, there's like a spreadsheet with a formula that tells you how much money, right? And in between, there's a lot to translate those principles into how do you design that formula. And I think of these as like that middle layer of how do we take those abstract principles and apply them to the Louisiana context and kind of guide the development of something more specific. So there are kind of four pieces of this which have different things underneath them. One is around access. So this discussion about building supply and serving kids. And what we've heard from this group is that there's an interest in targeting serving something like 60% of all children in the long term, prioritizing high poverty families in the short term. Strategically addressing gaps in access, including childcare deserts. The second piece is around adequate funding. So as I mentioned before from our last discussion, understanding the total need, understanding the true cost of quality, fairly funding providers across the mixed delivery system to make sure that families have a choice in where they get their care. And then I think this could go under several of these, but I put it here. Designing the formula to be ongoing without the need for annual reauthorization. So there's an adequate amount of funding that you can rely on going forward. We also have been talking about sources of funding. So maximizing existing funds and funding sources like Head Start and CCDF, making sure that whatever we design like aligns with their structure so that, you know, things that we can't control, like what the federal rules are kind of accounted for. There's a foundational role for state funding. There's an expectation for local contributions based on a local ability to contribute while not penalizing parishes and local governments who have already begun investing in ECE. And I'm going to unpack this a lot today. And then a need to kind of also wrap state funding around these funds to fill in the gaps. So if there's, you know, parishes that can't make that contribution, how do you kind of wrap in the state funds? And then the last piece is really building on existing structures that promote stability. So taking the model of the MFP and also the contracted slot strategy that that has already been, you know, started to be implemented to kind of build off of the work that's already happening in terms of promoting stability. What here jumps out or seems like it's missing or seems unclear?
My only worry when I read the headlines is the one word that's absent is quality. So I think we want expanded access, but we want it to be at least of sufficient quality. So I think, you know, the data that indicates access without quality isn't necessarily winning anything. So there needs to be there somewhere, or at least communicated.
Yeah, our sense has been that there's been a lot of work that's been done in that area, there's been a lot of progress, and this project is not necessarily meant to like place any of that, but also like want to shout sort of nods that and make sure that's.
I mean, whether it's from a political
Yeah.
angle or just from a continuity angle, I think making sure that that's building.
That could be elevated in the second one, because there is a reference within that, so instead of adequate funding, maybe it's quality funding or something.
Yeah.
To emphasize that dimension.
Yeah, adequacy is a word that comes up a lot in K-12 school funding, right? Like the constitutional right to an adequate education, those kind of things. And so that's a little bit of a borrowed term. It's not necessarily easy.
To just kind of add to that, I mean, we talked about the true cost of quality, and I am coming into this, I'm not familiar with what you all have done, but as a childcare provider, to truly understand what, and I don't know if any cost modeling has been done around cost of quality, but as you all know, it's going to look very different for every childcare center. What's the size of your childcare center? What sort of ratios are, you know, so when we talk about quality is highlighted under adequate funding, but that in and of itself is a huge, you know, we know the Kellogg Foundation had done quite a bit of studies around, you know, cost modeling. I don't know if any of that is embedded in this work.
Yeah, do you want?
No, I mean, we just, they have whatever follow that we've done with others.
Okay.
Yeah, and our Athens has done a lot of cost modeling in other states as well, so we have a pretty deep understanding of it. And I think there's ways to build up on the work that's already been done too, to think about like what's the cost of serving a child with special needs with different characteristics, like having a flexible model underneath this that sort of is able to answer those questions, I think is a really important part of that. Not to say that you're gonna model every single kid in every single center individually, right? But sort of at a system level, understand what that looks like.
Right.
Yeah. Reactions, thoughts? Interesting. Great. All right, we're almost to the part where I can stop talking and then you all can talk more. So as I mentioned the last time we met, we talked about the MFP as kind of a sort of a thought experiment. Like, what if we just took the MFP and we applied it to early childhood? What works, what doesn't work? And so we broke down the MFP process into 5 steps-ish. There's a lot more to it, obviously. Many people in this room know it much better than I do. But essentially, you know, starting with the base amount per pupil, and then adding weights based off of student characteristics, special education, economically disadvantaged, by like English language learners, and then counting the students, which is an important step, right? How many students do you have? How many of them qualify for those weights? And then the last 2 steps being around local contribution. So there's a formula where the state looks at sort of local ability to raise revenue. And overall, the aim is that local revenue makes up 35%, but that varies quite a bit from parish to parish. And then the state says, okay, you need this much, your local contribution is this much, which means your state contribution is the difference. They give that money to the parish and they can kind of do what they want within the context of running their schools. And I think there's, what we kind of determined in the discussion last time is the first 3 steps of this generally work fairly well, you know, as a structure. We can think about a base amount being based off of a cost model where we have the base amount for quality care. There's some weighting around student characteristics. And then the count of students, maybe looks a little different in ECE in the sense that enrollment might fluctuate more, or there might be more of a need to think about like creating supply where there isn't already supply. But overall, that frame kind of, like, we can build off of that frame. We had some big question marks about steps 4 and 5 of, what does this look like for ECE? And so that's really where we're gonna go next, and we're gonna start with number 4, which is around local funding. Maybe I'll pause and just see if Kate wants to add anything since I've run through all this. All right. All right, great. So to start with the funding piece, knowing that funding and how you spend the money are very closely interrelated, but just to kind of start us there. I know this group has spent a lot of time thinking about local funding of early childhood. So this is a refresher, not meant to be a replacement for the work that you all have already done. And I know there's a lot of text in this, it's pretty small on your page. But essentially there are a lot of different models for this. You'll see the matching fund on here, definitely an innovative model that Louisiana has pioneered to encourage local investment, which 14 parishes are now participating in. The millage add-on probably sounds familiar from the New Orleans context. There are also counties in Michigan that do this, that have a millage for early childhood investment. Portland has a children's levy that's been renewed by voters 4 times so far, so that's been a fairly common model across localities across the country. Special taxing districts are kind of an interesting one. If you don't have a local entity that's like a natural home for this, Florida allows you to create new ones. And then of course, to set aside existing funds, you can sort of create a fund within your kind of regular city structure or county structure. And then I know LPSC has done a lot of work on public-private partnerships and what that can look like, including like if you have a dedicated tax, if you have a bank within your area that has to make community investments, or if you have an entity that like hasn't been paying taxes because they got a tax incentive and then they start, some localities like put that aside into its own fund. So I say all of that just to say like this can look a lot of different ways, and just to kind of expand our imagination for what local funding can look like, which I know this group has already done a lot of work to think about. Are there other examples that you all would want to add to this list of like what does this look like at the local level, or it's promising or interesting?
So we did a whole study.
Yeah, you should be the smart at me.
Yeah, I mean, I think highlighting examples of what is happening in other places is very useful. I think the study that we did very much focuses on kind of digging into the Louisiana context and what are the mechanisms that we have in place now that locals could leverage. So that's more of the forward moving, what option might a local pursue.
Yeah.
So I think in terms of broad categories here, you hit those things. The only thing that's just kind of a looming issue is that Louisiana generally relies so heavily on sales taxes rather than property taxes that's worth acknowledging, and that's maybe a tradition that people are comfortable with and familiar with, but so you could argue it either way. I think my impression is our sales tax rates are so high that we might be better off, leaning towards property taxes for an initiative like this, like we do for schools. But of course, we're used to seeing initiatives for sales taxes. Some localities that may be a better opening. So anyway, some acknowledge that.
But like when you did the study, there wasn't much room.
That's true. There are statutory caps. And so there's not a lot of room, but for any individual parish or locality, there's usually some room. So,
On property taxes, the statutory have our sales taxes.
sales. So yeah.
Like to do assessment.
Yeah, or a dedicated tax. Yeah, or it could be a new local tax that's added. That's similar to what you're hearing here with the children's levy. That would be a property tax in Portland, or
What about the set aside?
yeah, set aside, sure,
That's for existing funds, right?
yeah. And that might be
That way people wouldn't think it's a new.
sure.
But then you have to.
Because it's only.
Yeah, it's a good thing we're doing a good year, right? Yeah.
No,
And then this was a while ago, it's just like. For the pandemic, we had done some work around looking at, taxing, like, urban venues, because this one Orleans was prior to even like, we're just talking about village stuff. But that got really.
Yeah, and I think particularly thinking about the areas that might have a little bit less rates, right, like. What might they have that, you know. Yeah, I think one takeaway for me is that like. Most of these are voter approved initiatives and they actually have been very successful, like this is a popular, no one else us too, right, this is a popular thing. When you kind of put it in front of people, and so there's like, you know. We often think like, oh, people don't want higher taxes, but it turns out when you kind of give them a very specific like.
I'd like to say like Paula and the Jefferson, I mean, too, but y'all did an like incredible job of like pulling together local leaders, because for a while in Jefferson Parish, you just couldn't even talk about that, so.
And I just wanna share, like, a consideration of rededication of funding has been sort of bubbling up with our Jefferson Parish group. Because as we know, Orleans and Jefferson are completely different animals, and so you throw that out, and depending on if it's an election, I mean, nobody's gonna touch it. People, there seems to be a bit more of an appetite for rededication. But we're getting there.
Yeah, but I would say like in New Orleans, if you looked at 21 and 23, their property millages and they got their bill, it was about the same, and 22 is the only year it dipped down, so it was. When they were talking about the millage, it was easier for us to talk about it, because we've already been paying this, something rolled off and we're just gonna roll it back.
Yeah, and that was the pilot recapture too, was like they had given a tax break to a big employer. The tax break was expiring, so they were getting new funds in that they didn't have before, right? And so they said, okay, we're gonna put those in their own like set aside spot, and then we're gonna use it dedicated for ECCE, we're not gonna roll it into general revenue fund. So when there is that kind of like aberration, like do something coming in, like if there's an opportunity to say, okay, this is gonna be a set aside.
And then I know like right now in the city, they're sitting on $12 million. So there's discussions there about like, you know, not taking away from the library, but you're sitting there on 12 million. How do you reallocate to be able to pull down?
Yeah.
So out of these 14 parishes, I know New Orleans has a millage, and who else in the state has a millage?
That's it.
That's it. So how do these other 14 parishes make the match? How do they
So
come up
like
with?
Caddo started with philanthropy, then went to traffic light cameras, and that's the whole political issue. So they're back to philanthropy, what they're trying to figure it out. Rapides is philanthropy as well. Jefferson.
We're Jefferson Parish City Council, our parish government,
Parish government?
started with the relationship. And hey, would you consider investing? And then
And how much do they invest?
right now, I believe we're at 300,000.
It's because each like
Discretionary funds from each of the, so there are 5 districts and then 2 at-larges. So each district member will put up X amount of discretionary funds, and then the at-large will put up some as well. So we've been able to, this is I believe our third or fourth year. So 250, 275, 300. But we've been trying to engage with the philanthropist, and it's just trying to knock down one door and you know, trying to identify who those people are.
It's the same people though, every, you know.
and philanthropy is not, I mean, it's not a
It's
Yeah.
the same families, it's the same companies, it's the same.
And
Well, we
not
have-
to throw a wrench in it, but I really haven't gotten the matching fund issue. That's about to be a problem at the state level. If we don't maintain the use of that fund for what its original purpose was, because the legislature's thinking of changing the use of that fund, so that'll screw that. That's what I've heard, but I'm just throwing it out there.
about the 4-year-olds.
One thing I'm hearing in this is like, there's some advantage to having a lot of different local strategies across the state where like it might work this way and here and this way here. And there's also like maybe some disadvantage to it because it makes everybody has to kind of invent the wheel on their own, right? They have to like build a relationship, maybe figure out the solution.
That's right.
And so is there some advantage to like having a menu or more about like, I mean, to say like, To give a little bit more playbook or a little bit more of a, you know, you have to do it this, I mean, you probably don't wanna say everybody has to do a millage, right, because that doesn't really make sense across every area, but is there some advantage to being a little bit more prescriptive in how people come in, and just to make it easier on the, you know, to fewer options on the table when you start talking.
I would say a playbook is helpful, but I'd also say the skill set of the people trying to move the work is incredibly important.
Yeah.
You know, our executive leader for the Jefferson Variety Start Network is a PhD with early ed. What is Sorintha? I mean,
Early child special.
that is what that
That's what you know, yeah.
she's been able to, you know, and I've called myself government relations, right? Because that is what I feel like we're doing a lot of. So while I think a playbook would be helpful, I'd say the first thing we're gonna do is build relationships, you know, and then what does it look like within your community? I would have loved to have a playbook and said, okay, knock on this person's door, go have coffee with this person. They're gonna do this, this is gonna, but I
If you
do.
had a playbook with children's funding project related to like, thinking about timing, if you're gonna do a village, like these
The
are.
village, absolutely,
Yeah, like there's certain
definitely have
benefits
that.
and there aren't, but sort of
But
goals,
what we've done,
but the community pieces.
yeah.
Yeah, so, yeah, yeah, so maybe let's go to kind of these questions for discussion to kind of frame us a little bit here. I just want to point out that we talked about the MFP already, but I thought this was really striking. The local contributions within the MFP range from about 70% of the costs in Cameron and let's say this wrong, Iberville, I should know that, to 23% in Washington. So Iberville allows for $18,000 per pupil. Is their kind of contribution, when you do the math on what they can, you know, contribute based on their tax base, 2,300 in Washington. So that's a very wide range, right? Of what parishes are expected to put in toward their K-12 education. And in practice, local contributions have increased kind of past state contributions. Probably a variety of things going on there, but the overall like idea is that the state should be 65% and the local should be 35% across the state. So I actually maybe like given the conversation we're having about what this looks like across parishes, I'm curious about this question about like what would it mean to have required contributions to ECCE versus incentivized? It like in K-12, it's just this is what you have to put in, right? What would that look like? Is that even something we want to consider for ECE? Does that turn people like away from their enthusiasm?
There's a law banning unfunded mandates on school systems, for example, so. I mean, if you're thinking of funneling that through school system, wouldn't that run foul of that?
When not all of them are.
Right, right, but.
I just worry about the locals that just don't have.
There are a lot of parishes that are losing population and can't provide clean water.
Water.
Asking them to come up with a new cost, I think would be politically difficult and practically very almost impossible.
Well, I mean, I guess I don't disagree. My question is more the political of, is it easier to get a you know, a match or a opt-in sort of thing through and then go back and patch up the fact that that's a problem? Because like my sense is mandating something comes with its own political, like what about the exceptions, right? If you say it's an opt-in, you get then 80% of people are happy with it and then you go back and solve for the 20%. So that's my only question. Like I don't disagree that that is a problem, but in a world where we haven't even approached solving this problem historically, I say get what you can get done and then recognize, at least on your own end, that there's going to be problems with whatever you do and then
So
solve
why
for it.
isn't there a problem with the MFP then? I mean, you look at it, at Washington, at what, 2,300, I mean, they come up with something.
Then the MFP weights are there for a Washington parish that can't.
Right, but wouldn't it be the, I mean, aren't we talking about the same structure? So, I mean, Washington wouldn't put up the same amount for early childhood that
And, you know,
Oh,
First, that model
St.
states
Cameron.
that the state is definitively gonna match something, and I'm not sure that commitment's even been made.
Right, yeah, well,
That would
let's
not
right, like, if we think about where we're trying to get to in terms of the North Star, right, when we're, right?
And that's also.
Not what we're doing this year, right, it's not, but also like, if you think about a sliding scale approach, like. There could be a $0 contribution, right, for parishes that are really on one end of that scale, or a very, very low, contribution, but, yeah.
I kind of agree with you, I was just gonna say the difference is that, public education is a product that's available to everybody, and we're not talking about that yet. I wish we were, but we're not at that point yet, so.
Do a little bit of a chicken and egg thing of like, how do we tell people they have to kick into this if they can't access it yet, then how do we build the access?
It's almost a big picture of like when we view childcare as a public good, this is just a service, again. What was in place 70 years ago, we didn't need it, both parents were not working, someone was staying home with the child, that is not the case. So we have to shift the mindset, and that's not a in the weeds sort of answer here, this is more of Jan's point, like, well, K through 12, it's in there. We're not there yet with childcare, so how do we shift that mindset?
we shifted by not saying childcare, but child.
Early childhood
education,
Yeah,
because
yeah.
that's what too many of my fellow legislators feel, it's just
Babysitting,
babysitting.
oh yeah.
And they continue to say that, even though they know well, that's what they say. And we're paying, $12,000 a kid for babysitting. Yeah.
Even if you break that $12,000, the kid do.
Oh, well,
You know.
Yeah. So what about these two questions at the bottom here? What structure is most supportive for low tax capacity areas and high tax capacity areas? I think that there is a world we can think about different strategies, right? Like they don't necessarily all have to run through the same. So if the matching fund is working really well for high tax capacity areas, do we then just need a different strategy, just to your point, to kind of fill in that gap, right?
Revenue into the fund that is able to meet the needs of the locals that can. They can do have the match, but then you have enough left over to meet the needs of the locals that can.
As you point out,
I was gonna say, can we think about CCAP dollars serving as part of the matching? If we think about that as a way of offering some heavily subsidized, redefine how we target those dollars if they're going to low income families, but could we structure that in a way that helps to maybe it just has to follow the kid, it doesn't work, but is there a way that we can bring that in to help
To incentivize.
put more dollars into the low tax capacity areas? Or at least structure it as a way that,
Do we have more demand from locals right now than we have in the state?
We will in about 18 months.
In 18 months, okay.
Yeah, but for
So we-
childcare assistance.
No, for
Match fund.
Oh, yes.
But that's good. I mean, and that need could be brought up, but I like your idea too. I mean, if you needed funds in the short run.
Does that, am I hearing like it comes away from a CCAP voucher and goes into a matching fund?
what I'm, and I haven't thought this through at all,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
the idea might just be to think of that as part of this discussion, so that if we're thinking about a sense of fairness between places that have capacity, putting a lot more local dollars in, places that don't have the capacity, acknowledging that there's, or, accounting for in some way that there are other non-local dollars that are supporting the program, it's not all states back, kind of.
I think about a contract slot strategy, like targeting those contract slots to areas that don't have a local, and so I think that we talked about early on in this process, like, if you imagine like a garden with watering cans and flower pots, like each funding stream is its own watering can, right? And right now we like make decisions based off of each funding stream, like how that watering can is gonna go, right? But if we kind of shift the perspective and think about what does each flower pot need, how much water, right? Some of them are getting their water from local contributions, some of them are getting their water from CCAP. And we can kind of think about like, what's the end product of that, where they're each getting.
The only like the cause for pause for me is that even in New Orleans that has a millage, you still have thousands of children that aren't being served. And so it's not like a district K-12 model. People are getting served one way or another. It's not that way in early ed. But again, it doesn't, I mean, you've gotta be innovative and think about what are possibilities.
Whatever we can do to incentivize locals and, you know, every year when early childhood funding comes up in the legislature, it's always, they've got plenty of money. We got all this money from the feds, they got all this money, they got all this money, and look, they've got this much money in their account, and why is it costing this much money to educate a kid? I think that if we're shooting, I've been wrong for a long, that if you show, you know, we have this many districts who are putting up this much money and do need the match. I think it's an argument in next year's budget to make sure that pot is larger and can meet that demand, because I think that's what we want to do. I mean, that's the goal long term, is to have locals buy in. And it seems to me that would be a good way to get to show what the demand actually is.
Yeah, I think the demand outstripping the funds is a real incentive for increasing
Here's what
funds,
your,
otherwise.
here's what your district is willing to put up.
Yeah.
What are you gonna do on the
Correct.
state level to make sure it happens
Yeah,
for
you
your
don't get
kids?
infusion, like, let's see, new dollars that were recognized for this year that could potentially go into the fund. Then if they don't, if that doesn't happen in 25, 26, there isn't gonna be
Yeah.
enough fund.
Yeah, and I mean, we shouldn't have to play
That is
chicken,
correct.
but yeah,
It's still,
this is,
Most networks are struggling to raise large amounts of dollars, so keep in mind that they've got 14 networks that are looking for match from the fund. Some of that is $1,000, $12,000, and East Iberville works very hard. I just think that's interesting because this example that you shared with us, that they have not yet been able to raise local funds for despite very concerted, strong efforts there.
well, I mean, that example takes me to what I was gonna say earlier, which is striking me that, you know, if you look at your MFP examples, the high end are places with a heavy industrial base of very few people, right? And the low end are a place with effectively no industry and a moderate amount of people. And you got everything in between. And it strikes me that we have broken these funding down by somewhat arbitrary geographies, which I understand are the way that we politically subdivide, but the reality is any number of the people that work at the Dow individual parish live in East Baton Rouge or Ascension Parish and they drive in, right? So the tax base stays in one place, even though they reside somewhere else, and now granted their incomes coming back, et cetera. But the services and their kids in most cases are being either cared for a couple blocks from their home or a couple blocks from their work. And my guess is it's a couple blocks from their home, given the way that that's playing out. So it strikes me that there may be an interesting way to do sort of the voluntary contribution thing in a way that opens up some, because like, you know, our feedback from our friends in Iberville and Cameron parishes, we might have extra money for education, but we don't have enough money for roads because we got trucks coming in and out, not people, right? So our roads are falling apart, but there's, you know, the structure is not, yeah. So I don't know what's there, but it strikes me that a more regional approach to some of this may be an interesting way to skin the cat of approaching that.
Yeah, I mean, in K-12, there's a lot of problems with the reliance on local funding, right? Like you know, the state often plays an equalizing role, you kind of end up with some areas that can invest a lot in their schools, some, you know, so there's some advantage to relying more heavily on the state strategy. At the same time, but I'm also think there's a real political benefit to having localities that are invested in this and asking for it and you know, feeling ownership of it. So it's not necessarily clear to me that like this should be a local, the local should have to come in with funds, right? But it does seem like if to the point of like, how do we scale this? You know, it's one strategy.
I mean, I think politically locals have to come in, at least for the foreseeable future. Like, this is not assumed to be a universal requirement. The way you make it an assumption is if every locality or most localities do it, then everybody expects to do it, and then it becomes an assumption, at which point you can roll off the local obligation. But I don't know, short of a magic wand, how you get there otherwise.
back to that public good conversation, I think when locals do invest, not only does my research, recent dissertation show that is the way to do, right? It's gotta be federal, state and local, but it also shows investment and that idea that we're not babysitting. Jefferson Parish leaders don't think what I do is babysitting when they're
That's what
investing.
I wonder, do all 14 of those areas, do their senators and representatives know what they are putting up?
Yeah, that's because Thomas Presley will tell people what they need to do. Yeah, so, but I think it's very, yeah, I don't think that's true, your assumption or your point of view. I don't think that means the networks aren't trying, but they may not be getting responsiveness from those representatives.
And to your point, it's 14 out of 20 parishes,
40,
like it's a lot more
yeah.
than 14, right? So it's, you know, there's a lot of parishes that aren't covered by the strategy yet. So right now, these run through Ready Start networks, which many of them are based in school districts, not all. To your point about like a regional role, does that feel like the right entity to build off of? Is there a reason to think about like other local players who might be, you know?
And some of the Ready Start networks, to your point earlier about regional, some of them, there are some that are regional. And then we're in enough conversations throughout the state of like, who is the entity that could potentially go after local dollars? And sometimes it's an area foundation, sometimes it is a district school district, like it really does depend on.
So in Jefferson's through the parish, like the parish council, city council.
So we get to be real complicated. So while we live under, our network lives under the school system, we have partnered with a local community foundation to serve as our 501c3. So any money raised gets to go through that 501c3.
there.
Yeah.
But to the point, that model is reasonably replicable everywhere. I mean, with the exception of Northeast Louisiana, where there's not really a community foundation, you have a willing partner everywhere.
Louisiana Children's Coalition that could operate.
Could do, correct, yeah, they're not really a foundation, they can fund in that way. Yeah.
I think what I'm hearing is that this group feels pretty strongly that there's a local role in funding for both political reasons and practical reasons. And that the matching fund structure is very promising for parishes that have the ability to contribute. And then there's like some challenges with it around building political will at the local level. And the consistency of the state level, right? But we had a conversation with the folks in New Orleans who do the city seats program, and they keep the funds separate, the state funds and the local funds, right? Because the state funds could go away. And so they have to make sure that that creates a big administrative problem, right? Or challenge, because like they're administering two separate parallel programs that are on different timelines, that have different rules. And part of the idea behind a coherent funding design is to get rid of some of those pieces, right? But if you know the state funds could go away, you have to keep them separate, right? So there's an element at the state level of like guaranteeing and stabilizing that.
And there's the continuity of care issues, like if we had Jen here with agenda, and she would like, if we were talking about the fund, she would start a whole conversation of like, how do we get to a point that we're allocated, if it is 21 million, but allocated a certain amount over 3 years so that you have a cohort, so that you have kids that can stay in through, and it's been complex.
Sort of forward funding, so that you're not waiting until July to find out how many seats you have, and then
And then you're stuck in a situation with providers that, they're waiting on bated breath to know what's gonna happen, right?
Yeah. So that's one piece of the matching fund, is both at the local and the state level, building that kind of stability, momentum, and expansion over time. And then the other piece is figuring out a strategy for the parishes where the matching fund is not a realistic way to come in, right? And that could look like targeting federal dollars to those areas, because there's not going to be the same like state local kind of division. It could look like having enough money in the matching fund to be able to say we're going to either make a 3-to-1 match for some areas that have lower capacity, or we're gonna not require a match for some areas based off their tax capacity and just be able to like allocate seats without that. Am I summarizing? Well, what else would people add to that summary? Or what have we not thought about in terms of local? I think I left out the regional approach, that would be. Working on Zoom.
Parishes don't have, or communities don't have a Ready Start now, because y'all have expanded, what are we at, 41 now? So, that's about, I should be able to do this math. 23. And but some of the Ready Starts, a couple of these like some of these. It's like, you've got like Children's Coalition, for example. But community networks can apply for this money. It doesn't have to be Ready Start. It's just, of course, I'm assuming you're thinking to some degree, Ready Start's over working on that access expansion more than community networks can.
Yeah, I think that speaks to kind of the local capacity piece of this. So maybe let's look at the next section here, which is around, the question that's raised is okay, localities are contributing money. How much control do they have for what happens with it? For the MFP, it's really, they get the money from the state and then they use it to run schools. Like there's really not a whole, they have almost complete discretion, right? As long as they're sort of following all the laws. They have a charter school adjustment in some cases, but for the most part, they really get to decide how they allocate the funds across their programs, across their schools. They have a lot of discretion. ECE currently very different, right? Most of the funding goes directly to the provider or the family. CCDF funds have to be tracked to eligible children at a licensed provider. And then Ready Start networks have input into allocation decisions and needs assessments. I keep saying many member-based school districts because my role in my team is to be the person who's really knowing about home-based programs. And that often is a real challenge, when you're talking about school districts, because it's just not the model they're used to. And like home-based, they don't have the systems. It's just a really that can be a real tension point. And they're not, we were just saying, present in all parts of the state. So what should their role be if they're going to be, playing this role of raising funds and being a local agent? And we kind of broke down on the next slide, what do we mean when we say management and governance? Because there's a lot of different pieces under that umbrella, and these are some of them, not a comprehensive list. But some of the things that they're doing now around identifying and prioritizing needs, informing budgeting, making decisions about allocations, who gets what funds, who gets which seats, determining family eligibility and managing enrollment, administering the funding distribution, cutting the checks, making sure they get to the right place, conducting monitoring and compliance oversight, annual auditing, program, program visits, probably other things too. There are other things that are not on this list. I just want to add to it. And these don't all have to live in the same place, right? There definitely could be things that are more appropriate as a state role, more appropriate as a local role, where maybe local should have input, but the state should do the heavy lifting, or vice versa. So these don't have to all kind of live under the same entity. Are there other things that folks would add to this list for governance management?
Abby, I don't know if y'all can hear me, but I'll just add that these are really, when we think about funding and finance roles of management and oversight, and obviously that situates within a lot of other responsibilities, along the lines of developing and executing a system level vision, supporting improved quality, supporting our professionals, family and community engagement, data management, so on and so forth.
Specific more to the funding side.
On this list, though, shouldn't there be some acknowledgement of Michael's point earlier about quality and that the funding needs to support and be steered toward quality programs.
Yeah, so I definitely think that, yeah, about allocation decisions when you're thinking about budgeting. That quality is playing a role in those decisions for sure, and needs. One of the questions that I'm very interested to dig into here. Where is there benefit to having a local role in funding determination or distribution? Where are there risks or challenges? And related to that, where is the state better positioned to play the lead role? What elements of governance within that list could incorporate a local or regional role? And then some of this conversation about like what entities are best positioned to do that. And then this is me being about home-based programs again. How do you ensure that funding is fairly distributed across the mixed delivery system? And not to the programs that are sort of best positioned to handle the administrative complexity of it. Let's start with the first one. What are the benefits of a local role in these functions? What are the risks or challenges? I'll jump in, please.
So I would say that our lead agency knows our childcare centers very well. They're in and out of those spaces. They are holding hands with the ones who need a lot of hand holding, increasing quality. I think it's just an idea of they know what the needs are more so than others.
But I can imagine there's some tension to that too, right? Because if they're deciding who gets what funding, and they also like are very integrated in the community and supporting people day to day, like that could be challenging, right? Like
Yeah, but I think when you create a system that says, I'm not determining this, but this third party is determining the funding, and it's based on a very clean matrix of what is your quality. We've done these supports to help your quality, because at the end of the day, we want federal funds to go to children who are going to be successful. Those children are successful when they're in quality centers. So putting guardrails in place with centers that say, we'll offer you funds, but you're going to pay X amount of dollars, you're going to lower your ratio, you're going to do this. That speaks to why Representative Freiberg said, I'm making you a senator already. Make that happen in this environment. But why is it quality? Why does it cost so much? Because we're not paying $7.25 an hour, we're paying $20 an hour. Because we have lower ratios, because these teachers have attended trainings that really are research-based, that are going to be intentional. There's so much in that piece. And so locals, many of them, not all of them, do know that work, so.
what I'm hearing you say is like there needs to be really clear, like policy around how funding gets distributed that everyone understands that they can point to, right? So it's not like a personal thing where it's like, you're my neighbor and so I'm gonna, but then the locals are best positioned to be in that supportive role to say, okay, here's what you have to meet, let's figure out how to get you there.
And I think that they can give feedback on, because you've got smaller centers and parishes who can't always participate in every opportunity, but are shown. So you don't want them left out of an opportunity for funding, it seems, just because they can't participate in other supportive activities. I mean, not really.
Being that voice too, when there is an opportunity, when there is a decision to be made about, what the need is in my area, what the opportunities are. If you look at this list, are there things on here that jump out as like definitely local, definitely state, should be a partnership?
I mean, I think that now because of decisions with CCE administration, that the funding distribution is against states. There's already with it's going into CCE versus just local.
Yeah, contracted seats are really if this plays out, right? Because there's a real decision there, unlike with the voucher where the family just says, there's my truck going wherever, right? Like, there's really a strategy behind that, and that's really good and important, right? To be thinking about how to use that as a tool to build supply, to build stability. And, you know, within limited funds, there's decisions to be made there that are real trade-offs, so. It's a place where affordable has been playing a role as well. But I think is, you know, in the vision where we're moving the system toward more and more things like that, right? It becomes more and more important to have that input.
I mean, it strikes me that the model we largely use in K-12 is both from a political standpoint and from a where we would ideally is probably the wrong word, but should land. I mean, in some ways, locals can and should make as many decisions as they're capable of making. And so it strikes me that the state's argument here is broad strokes accountability, helping to, you know, ultimately scale up to a point where we've got the sort of things that we need in places, ensuring some degree of equitable funding and incentivizing sort of growth in a good direction. And then outside of that, kind of getting out of the way. Like, and that's not to say that over time you don't have to do other things, but you know, do local school districts make the best choices? No. But is the state and make all sorts of terrible decisions? But is the state going to make better decisions? No. It'll probably make just as bad decisions in a way, right? So you know, if all things being equal, let you make a local bad decision that doesn't have the same degree of scale and problem. It's, you know, it's the whole experimentation idea of America, right? So it's going to screw up, but it's going to screw up in a localized way, and then you have very local accountability to the people who screwed up. You know, and then they have to solve it. So I do think the state ought to push in some direction, but the idea of like the state saying, here's the only sorts of kids you can use it. Like, yes, if there's funding that you can only get federally at a state level, sure, the state needs to play that role. But I think to the degree possible, making those local governance decisions is politically and otherwise the right way to go.
I'm curious, like, yeah, like that's a I would say one end of the spectrum. Like, is what are folks saying? Yeah.
But that was the vision when Register Network started, that was the vision for them, to be able, they know their local context best. They know where the need is, all those pieces of the puzzle that Michael just named, that they would have the ability to take that ownership. And some parishes have done, some networks have done really well, and some others not so much, but I mean, the same one with the school district.
Parishes generally are in one of those stuff.
Just one.
Just one.
It sounds like there are a few that are regional across different parishes, most of them are.
I thought Baton Rouge.
Baton Rouge has Baton Rouge and Baker, but like Zachary has its own.
Exactly.
So has its
Oh, yeah.
Anybody want to offer a different vision on the spectrum of? Or we have alignment around like as much local as we've been.
Melinda's getting ready. No, I like Michael's like idealized notion. It sounds lovely.
Oh yeah, it just doesn't, well, I mean.
Yeah.
Again, it's the flip side of like, it isn't lovely in reality, but we start looking at like really competent administration at the state level can temporarily do a better job, but then the question is, can you sustain competent management? And the answer is generally no, you can't. So
then what are the practical challenges? Like if you're feeling like that's a great place to go, like ideally,
But I
what's
would
between
say
here and
that
there?
one of the practical challenges is, and one of the reasons y'all have made decisions related to CCDF with contracted seats is, like, there's concern about fraud. I know, so that, I think that is something that we have to, there are also capacity issues,
Yeah, so many of our networks, I mean, very few networks have the capacity to keep adding on work. They've kind of reached their fill already, and the will is there, but a lot of the leaders in smaller rural areas are not EC leaders, they're EC through 12 leaders, and they are responsible for a very large body of work. So that's another challenge. I mean, when you do have regional models, that there are pros and cons to every approach, and one of the cons to that approach is some of the areas within that region just still don't get individualized focus and attention. So we see that happening as well. Because of course it's easier to work with the people who are more expensive. But, you know, if you're gonna take on that regional lead position, you really have to keep working too. It does seem like the state would have to be engaged in at least some of the more rural areas where you're gonna have the capacity problems and you're gonna have not just the is there enough capacity for the children in need, but also just the worker capacity. I mean, there are gonna be a lot of different problems in rural areas that I don't think all of us necessarily know about because we tend to live in urban or suburban areas, but it seems like that would specifically be an area where state oversight and more direct management might be required in some capacity.
It's easier to have specialists to cover the state or a large region of the state as opposed to like probably not enough people in a really rural parish to sustain somebody who really specializes in ECE, right? Monitoring compliance or ECE enrollment, right? Like, so then you have somebody who's wearing a lot of hats in that area, they may not know it as well.
And is there consistent leadership that will stay?
Right, same problem, right? Yeah.
Well, and that tags onto an idea I guess I meant to say earlier, but I think the state can also very thoughtfully and rightly play call it a contracted services model, call it an economies of scale model, but like, there's just things that like, you don't need to buy 50 versions of curriculum and everybody doing that. There's like we can do some vetting for you and make it easier. You know, if 3 parishes want to share on services with a literacy specialist, like sure, we can play a role that serves as a hub at a higher level. Somebody else wants to do it, cool, but if not, we can do that in support of you. But I think the orientation is still, if you want to try to do it yourself, more power to you, but here's some quality assurance, here's some economies of scale. And I just think it leads to better local buy-in. It doesn't lead to this like, oh, the state's telling me I have to, but rather leads to you're offering me a service, thank you.
The state sort of has to play 2 roles, right? One is providing the service and the other is like monitoring the people who are doing it themselves, right? To make sure that they're doing it in the way that federal dollars are required. Yeah. I'm hearing kind of I'll try to summarize again. So I'm hearing kind of a value of decisions made as close to the local level, as close to the programs and kids as possible, with the understanding that there are capacity challenges within our current system, and that may not be feasible across all functions in areas that are less populated, maybe don't have as much of a local capacity within their school systems generally. And so there's need for the state to both play a supportive role of that, which could look like offering those services. There's a need to invest in local capacity if you want to move in this direction. And then there's a need to think about like what does accountability and oversight and all of that look like from the state level to make sure that it's happening in a way that's transparent, clear, good use of public dollars, as you kind of develop some of that decision making for the local level. That's what it is. It would correct my summary. Okay. Amazing. All right, well, we are solving all kinds of problems today. Thank you all for engaging in some of these like thought experiment types of things. I think the way I'm seeing this sort of fitting in to the other work is not to say that all of this is going to happen right away, but that as we start to outline these like values and priorities, that it can help to inform some of the intermediate steps. So just looking ahead, I think we are looking ahead to bring some of this back to the full ECCE commission. I know I have June on here, but I think it's actually gonna be July, right? The next meeting.
Oh, we're still working on
it. Okay,
Well,
TBD.
We haven't reached out since we have legislation for that you've authored with additional members, giving them a time to also participate with something we were cognizant of. So with that said, right now it's still in June. We may push to July to ensure that, those seats could be filled.
Sorry, I didn't mean to get ahead of you.
Since the legislation was, thank you for offering that legislation. We want to be cognizant of your newest members.
Yeah.
Yes,
Yeah.
we want to be cognizant of newest members that may not give us time to fill those vacancies. And so, if we do have new members, we will be potentially. So we're still in discussion, but we wanted to be cognizant of if new members would like to participate.
So whenever that meeting happens, we definitely want to be bringing back to that group some of the work that we've been doing around why is this important, what do we mean when we say funding design, what are we trying to accomplish with it? And then this group's kind of thinking on this emerging framework and some of these recommendations. And I'll sort of sneak preview that I think Katie and I would love to not be the ones doing most of the talking on that. So if there are folks in this group who might be willing to kind of represent some of this group's thinking, we might be reaching out to you all about, because I think like we are trying to sort of reflect what we're hearing from you all. And so we want you to be really kind of the owners of this process and work. So, and then we also are thinking about how we strategically support the recorded messaging that are coming up in September, which I know the ACS team is going to talk about the second half of this meeting. So we will be here to support that. But
So what other states, we've had this last meeting, what other states have you worked with doing this same kind of work?
so this is really innovative work. There are not really other states that have a funding formula for ECCE in the way that we think of it for K-12. We've looked for a lot of models on this and we have not found like great ones. Acton has done a lot of work in Illinois, and so we are working with them. They're moving to a single state agency for early childhood, and so we're thinking with them about how we I'll do some of this work around aligning funding streams across different programs, and we've worked with them on workforce compensation grants and using cost models to inform rates and like lots of pieces of this. So that's definitely underway.
As a reason I asked,
yeah.
because I was part of a group to do with the Harvard early childhood fellowship thing, and when we met together as legislators, it was like everybody's in the same place we are. Everybody's struggling for figuring out how you do the funding.
Yeah.
What do you do? And that's why I was curious as to other states you worked with.
Yeah, I mean, other states that have moved in this direction, and New Mexico is sort of the leader, right, in terms of having a state agency and taking a bunch of different pieces and trying to fit them together in a coherent system. Minnesota's done some work on it, Vermont's done some work on it. I think the best example I found is actually Canada, Ontario.
Oh, really?
Yeah, fascinating, different context, for sure. But they have a really interesting, you know, like, they're actually using a formula to distribute funds and they're moving toward that. So I'm not saying that you should like go talk about your legislator friends, be like, we should be Canada, but I'm happy to send along some.
And New Mexico.
New Mexico, yeah. But they're not necessarily using like a formula, but they have thought about how to bring the different programs and services together. And they actually identified fund that's either oil or like mining. It's some sort of natural resource fund.
Rather than our sports gaming.
I mean, yeah. So
Marijuana tax.
yeah, but it was a voter initiative, so they set aside revenues from this natural resource thing into like an early childhood fund. But it was the same thing. They created a fund, they funded it a little bit, they funded it a little bit more, and then eventually they identified like a long-term source for it. So yeah. I'd agree. Yeah. They're a very small state with natural resources, so it's great for them. It's true.
We're a relatively small state with natural resources.
We just don't.
We haven't ever spent them wisely.
All right, well, that's my part, but I'm happy to continue the conversation if I want to. We can pull together some other state reading if people are interested. We've been doing a lot of that ourselves. We're gonna take, I'll turn it back to you all.
It's up to y'all,
Yeah.
it's right at 10:25, so thank you for about an hour and a half.
I mean, you all really like, it was an efficient conversation, you know?
No, it was a good conversation.
Will there be like a summary document of what we discussed here?
Yes, so I enlisted Maddie to help take notes, thank you, and I think Katie's been taking notes as well, so I didn't take great notes because, but we will pull together notes and send that out as follow-up.
So would this group like to take a 5-minute break, or do y'all wanna just keep going through? I'm gonna defer to y'all on y'all's preference. You go.
Yeah. 30.
Oh, okay, 5 minutes, okay. Oh, we knew it's 10:30, okay. So I don't know, do we have everyone from We do have Scarlett and Lauren is going to be joining. So we may unfortunately naturally need to take a 4 minute just to get all of our presenters on, so we'll get started promptly at 10:30. Sorry, I forgot to check to make sure we had everyone. Oh, okay, but. Okay, so let's. Appreciate it. I think 20 says this pictures. Something else. Yeah. It's just like not making any sense. Great. I think. Perfect. Lauren, can you hear us?
I can. Can you hear me?
And it's coming out loud and clear.
Yeah, perfect. Hi, everyone.
So the second piece of this is thinking about the commission report, which is due in September. And so, I'm gonna transition over to, and Lauren, is Scarlett also gonna be speaking with you? I apologize. Take note of that. So Lauren is going to be, Lauren from Advocacy and Communication Solution will be leading our discussion as it relates to the September 2024 commission reports. And so I'll pass it over to her to introduce herself and other members of the team, as well as kind of provide us and anchor us into those reporting requirements from the legislation. Lauren, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thank you so much. It's lovely to be with you all virtually. I wish we could be there in person, but it's good to see everybody. So my name is Lauren Sogor, and I am with Advocacy and Communication Solutions. And you all may remember me. We've been working on this report for about 6 years now, so it's good to see many familiar faces. And I'm joined today with my colleague Scarlett Bowder, who is our co-founder and president, and also Betsy Russell, who helped us write our last report and will be supporting the writing of our report this fall as well. So we are just excited to be here and start to dive into this work. I think, one thing that is exciting as we are switching to kind of this new time frame for the report is that we have a little bit more time. So we know it's due at the end of September, but we're able to really start working on it already in May, which is great. So is it okay if I screen share? Will that work?
We've got the slides.
Oh, perfect. Okay, awesome. Thank you. I see it right there. Perfect. Okay, so we're just going to give a little bit of context, and then we're actually going to have the folks in the room take a little bit of time and just chat with one another. We're going to have you kind of just chat with a person next to you a little bit to do a little bit of brainstorming. But the first thing we wanted to do is just remind everyone of the purpose of this report and really the requirements legislatively. So the B3 task force, or sorry, the B3 commission report, which has come to the legislator annually, is supposed to be a report that provides the task force, so you all's findings and recommendations relative to establishing a vision for the future of ECE in Louisiana to the governor, members of the legislature, state superintendent, and state board of elementary and secondary education. So pretty high level, just kind of reminding everybody of what it is that we are supposed to be doing with this report. We can go ahead to the next slide. As I mentioned, this is the first year now that we're going to be switching from what has been a March submission of the report to a September submission. So you'll all remember we actually did do one in March of this year. So this 2024, we will have 2 reports, which is really an exciting opportunity to kind of rethink how we've been approaching this. So one of the things, and we'll talk more about this later, but one of the things we plan to do this summer is actually have one-on-one conversations with task force members to help shape the recommendations in the report, given that we don't have a ton of time to convene as a full task force. So we will be asking to chat with many of you this summer. And then again, just in terms of the process, we'll be outlining the report this summer. We'll be reconvening in July with you all to review and approve the outline. We'll continue writing. We'll ask for your feedback virtually. We know the commission will come together to approve the report at the end of August. And then, as you all know, it takes us about a month to get this polished and designed and finalized before it is due to the legislature at the end of September. So just kind of wanted to give everyone a sense of that timeline since it's a bit different than what we've had in the past. Next slide. So one of the things we think we really wanted to use this time with you all today is just to step back and really take the time and sort of this opportunity to rethink this report, how we use it, and how we can really maximize its impact. So we've really thought about this report as having 2 goals. It really is one important goal is to educate, right? So the folks that we mentioned at the top, those audiences, the state legislature, the governor, other decision makers in the state. We really want them to be educated on issues around early care and education, but we also want to spur action. So of course, those recommendations that we've included every year, always have some sort of very specific financial investment request. But there's other things we want folks who read this to do as well, whether that is to change their mind, or that is to, take a specific type of vote, or that is just to talk more about these issues in their own communities when they go home. We do want to spur action. And so that's really sort of from a high level where we see the goals of this report, really those two-pronged goals. So the first thing I'll just say is, do folks agree? Do you all also feel that those are the goals of the report?
Yes.
You're getting nods.
Great.
Is that
Great.
what we're aiming for? To educate people and to spur action, both legislatively as well?
Perfect. Great. I will take that as a win. Awesome. We will keep on trucking then. Okay, so we can go to the next slide. So audiences, obviously the ones that are listed in that very first slide are very clearly our primary target audiences, the policymakers, and that could be legislative and executive policymakers and their staff. But then also advocates, so I think one of the things we are aware of is that this can serve as a really useful tool for advocates around the state who themselves are trying to go out and reinforce those policy asks that we're making in this document. And so making something that they can use is also very valuable. But of course, that primary audience is really the folks who are going to make the decisions about implementing these recommendations. So that was just kind of another level setting piece we wanted to give. We can go to the next slide.
So I'll just quickly say on that, I think those are both true, and I think over the last series of years, we've also found there's just a more general public consumption argument. Not so much with the whole report, but with the headlines, the key findings that I think we need to be conscious of, that feedback given that. I mean, it is headline writing, a couple times a year relative to whatever's put in there.
Thank you. That's a great point. Yeah. So that general public, maybe even media, right, audience is that third one. Yeah, that's a great point. Thank you. All right. Okay, so we sent you all a short survey about a week ago, and as far as I know, about half the task force completed it. And we had asked you, and actually I have different slides because I updated a couple things, but that's okay. I'm just gonna go with it. So what we heard when we asked you basically this question, we gave you a series of options and said, of the things that you see below, what is the most important thing for our audiences to know that is going to spur them to action? And we gave you options that included academic impact of early care and education, the economic impact, why quality is so expensive, what quality looks like in practice, like in a classroom, how the state of Louisiana looks when it comes to early care and education access, cost, need, and then kind of said it, and is there anything else? And the 5 folks who responded said economic impact is the most important thing for our legislators to understand after they read this report in order to spur action. So I'm going to ask this question. If you did not respond to the survey, would you agree that economic impact is the most important thing for legislators to know in order to spur action?
Yeah, I think but economic impact is clearly like something that drives legislative decisions. I also think the educational impact is important, since education and the state of education in Louisiana is such a common thread of discussion every legislative session.
That's what I think, economic impact, because education is part of it. Without the education, the economic impact is kind of a big umbrella.
Right, I agree.
And health and education and.
I just want to make sure that education piece is highlighted underneath that umbrella very clearly. Because I think sometimes we all spend so much time talking about this that we understand this stuff and Libby could speak to this better than I could, but I'm sure Jan and I both hear the same thing when we talk to legislators. There are a lot of people who still just don't believe in the educational impact of
Yeah.
early childhood.
Why are we pouring so much money into this?
Right,
Yeah.
so I just think that while that informs the economic piece, and the economic piece is the most important thing to discuss, I do think we need to make sure we highlight the educational impact, because that's still a roadblock. Yeah.
Okay. Great.
I also think there's, and this may be subtle or maybe it's just in the story or two, but it continues to strike me that there's sort of a heartstrings, a moral, some other set of argument that you can make on sort of the, you know, we are politically a relatively pro-life state. People get very animated when you start talking about young children, moms, etc. So I think there's something there to say, like, how can we do right by this precious child of God kind of thing in a way that is resonant in 1, 2, 3 stories that then also has the economic and other thing. Again, I understand that may not resonate in the same way, but I think if you can stack these things.
Yeah, thank you. I think you just highlighted a great point, which is that over the course of these last 6 reports, you know, we have made this report work hard. We have tried to tell a big story, and we've tried to make a lot of points. And there's nothing wrong with that, but I do think now is a time to really think about the most impactful arguments that we can make, knowing that there are other resources too that can inform legislators about the issues around early care and education. But I think that is a very good segue into what we want to sort of have you just take about 15 minutes. We're going to have you just turn to the person next to you. If you are not a member of the task force, you do not have to do this assignment, but you can. But ideally, want the task force members just pair up, and we want you to actually take a couple of minutes and talk amongst yourselves when you think about and I'm going to start with the economic impact. I'm going to keep us up in that space for right now. When you think about making the economic impact case to legislators, what are the 2 to 3 things that are most important for them to hear? So examples on the economic impact arguments that we've made in the past are things like long-term return on investment, implications for the workforce, you know, implications for the tax base, long-term implications for the economic security of the kids when they grow up. Those are examples. So we want you to just take, actually I'm going to say 10 minutes, turn to the person next to you and talk for a little while about the 2 to 3 most important points when it comes to economic impact of early care and education that you would want to put in this report. So go ahead. I'm going to set a timer on my end, and I will give everybody a 2-minute warning.
Lauren, do you want to be able to hear?
No. I'm going to have everybody report out. So don't worry. Okay, 3-minute warning. We'll regroup in 3 minutes. Okay, 1 minute. All right. I want to hear from everybody, and I know.
Kind of, yeah, it's scary how specific you can get. Like,
So is this what you were presenting?
That's what.
No, there was a presentation prior. They were very, very high. Oh, my. So I think it sounds like there was big Lauren is eager to hear.
Okay. I know, sorry, it's hard for me to do this not in the room, but I definitely was able to see all the productive conversations, and Karen shared a few tidbits with us. So I would love to just have somebody from each of your little groups share the 2 to 3 things that you all felt that came up in your conversations you felt were really, really important. And I will ask you all to figure out who goes first.
I'll go first just because I need to dip out. So, Barbara and I were talking about workforce development. That being a level of detail that we would want to get into, especially with when you invest in early care and education, you have lower rates of issues with prison, better health outcomes, and wouldn't have to spend as much on remediation in the state.
Okay.
And the other piece, just to put a flag in, is that the constant things that Barbara hears and those of us who are in the Capitol hear a fair amount is that we do have enough money. You know, we have enough, all this money with the feds, we really don't need anything. And not really understanding, even though y'all done a really good job within the report saying, with the money that comes in with the feds, this is still what we need, state investment. That still seems to get missed.
Okay, so that's a myth basically that you all hear a lot.
Fake news.
Yep. Thank you.
Michael has some good ideas, I think, on how you can change that technology.
Well, I mean, I think what we spent most of our time talking about was just the way to make very concrete some of these concepts. So you have a pre-meeting with business leaders and you have them as pull-out quotes. So you have the CEO of Exxon, or you have whoever else saying, part of what holds me back from investing more in Louisiana is we don't have this problem solved, right? Or some other equivalent localized quote that is both scary and motivating. So you have some of those pull-out quotes that sort of break through and write the article for themselves. And then similarly, you have some sort of parental child story that also breaks through in sort of an emotive way. Here was the experience for this child, for this family, in a way that also winds up in the ultimate quoted piece. And I think you're trying to, whether it's legislators themselves being quoted and saying the finances make sense to me, a business leader saying it makes sense to me, or a personalized story, having those pull out quotes be the things that break through. And the rest of the report can be there, but I don't think most people read it. It's the headline and it's the quotes that sort of make the case you want.
Thank you. What else?
If I could just add a small thought to the comment about federal money, the fact that we have gone through recent years with lots of one-time federal money, I think made that particularly difficult. So underscoring that from sort of a retrospective historical meaning worth doing, just that there was one-time money, it's over, it's gone. Just.
And the piece with that too is that, we knew we needed that one-time money before COVID ever happened.
Yeah.
So it wasn't like, oh, they just flooded us with money that we didn't need. We actually needed that, and we need that to continue.
But the word at the capital, you hear people say, well, we can't always fill these gaps when we get this one-time federal money. We can't expect to fill that gap when that money goes away, and this is just a gap we can't fill. Well, like Libby said, it's a gap we need to fill. And how do you? But have you seen the news articles around the country of the layoffs of teachers because of the ESSA money going away and people being laid off and all over the country?
Yeah. What else? What else came up in folks' conversations?
We talked a lot about the idea of the ROI and how that is important to a lot of policymakers, and they may look at it in different ways depending on kind of their political orientation. But the idea that investments in early childhood will reduce the need for spending later on social programs, turn people into more productive taxpayers, and then also the short-term effect on employment. That it helps people right now, go to work and have someplace for their kids.
What's interesting to me is when I talk to my fellow legislators about ROI, you know what they say? Is that data from Louisiana? And they don't want to believe it. They don't want to believe you can have a 15-to-1 or which is shown to be, but because it didn't come from Louisiana, they blow me off, which is really strange, I think. Maybe they don't, certainly they don't look.
Well, this new state data system, LA First, that we're building this year, that this gives us a chance to take even things that are well established elsewhere, try to reproduce the results with Louisiana data to answer the question.
Yeah.
We also talked
Okay.
about school outcomes, the idea that we are spending a lot of money newly investing in literacy, tutoring programs, all these things that the department is asking for, tens of millions of dollars to fund. Where if there was, if children got early childhood education, they would go to school better prepared, and you would lessen the need for those kind of infusions of sort of catch-up money.
Yep.
Right, but you would need, yeah, exactly, you would need less remediation if you actually spend some money on early childhood education on the front end, and so it would lessen the need to come up with ways to fill gaps in educational programs and would improve school outcomes writ large.
Well, as a piggyback to that, and I'm not sure that they want this, but the event that Lynn and I were both at last night, or Representative Freiberg and I were at, was some data analysis done by the Baton Rouge Area Foundation, which basically said if you look at 20 years worth of data, you can see where kids went to early ed, where they went to K-12, and whether they wind up in the criminal justice system. And there's a very clear through line that we could kind of tell by second and third grade based on reading scores where kids were going to wind up actually in Baton Rouge, in prison, involved in violent crime 20 years later. And then there's also a corollary that if you move kids to better centers and supports, they don't wind up there, right? And so I think it strikes me that there's some creative math and creative arguing, but you could use to the localized data standpoint to say, here's what we see nationally, and here's what we see very locally in a way that makes a picture of we could do differently. In fact, we have seen, based on randomized chance, how things can go differently.
Is that data publicly available? Because
Yeah.
to Representative Freiberg's point, that would be a good set of data to use.
But I think not only for Baton Rouge,
Yeah.
but I think there's state data as far as if they weren't reading or they dropped out or, I think we have.
Yeah. It was all state data
incarceration in the
sets, yeah.
state.
So it's yes, it is publicly available. Yes, it is there now. You know, I'm also quoting from some stuff I know from their behind the scenes data. So I don't know how punchy they would want to be in this, but I think there's a way to weave that together thoughtfully. That lets everybody feel reasonably comfortable, but still make the argument of we know this both locally and nationally, and the ROI is very real in ways that we can tangibly see here.
Yep. Okay, so I heard sort of three, I would say, big themes that I think it's, and of course, you know, for us, it's starting to scaffold into like, what is the story that we want to tell? I heard the concept of ROI as both the immediate impact on the workforce, people being able to literally work because they have childcare. I heard the long-term ROI in terms of if you make an investment in early care and education now, we ultimately will end up with fewer costs incurred in lots of different areas, from K through 12 education remediation to health to justice system involvement. So it is this sort of continuum. You invest now, and there's all of these dividends that you yield across the lifespan of a person and in the context of our economic system. And then I heard I guess that was kind of one big theme. The second big theme I hear is this sort of sticky myth that that the ECE system has what it needs, that especially in light of, right, sort of the double-edged sword of the COVID and influx of funding is there's this sense that, well, you have it. What do you need? Like, what are you coming back to us for? So really having to figure out how we address that myth. And then the third big theme I heard is the storytelling piece. And this has come up in a couple of years of these conversations. I remember a long time ago, maybe even like the 2019 or 2020 report, we had some quote call outs. I'm hearing some interest and maybe revisiting, infusing this with some of those testimonials, quotes from, in particular, from business stakeholder employers, right? To be able to say, this is how it impacts me. Maybe some legislators, especially those who would maybe traditionally not be seen as immediate supporters, and then maybe families to talk. I think I specifically heard too, the one angle there on the family side would be the impact of access to childcare on the family's ability to work, right, and pursue their own economic stability. So I heard those sort of three big themes. Did I accurately say back what you all sort of bubbled up as the key things for you? I can't see if people are nodding, but I'm assuming I didn't hear
Yes.
no. All right, thank you. It's very hard to see, I'm sorry. Okay, awesome. That is extremely helpful. So I think that gives us a sense of some of how to start to frame this. I do want to ask another sort of high level strategy question, which is, this, and I think everyone around this table has been here for at least one of these reports by now, but in general, historically, we have organized this in 3 or 4 recommendations, and at least 2 of them are about an immediate financial influx, right? So give this money now to pay for seats, to infuse the ECE fund for matching, and then usually some sort of longer term, little bit more complex policy idea, something around things like workforce compensation, or obviously in this case, the funding design. I think one question that I kind of want to pose is, would it make sense, especially given our goals and our audience, to more explicitly bifurcate the report to say, we have both immediate needs and we have long-term needs, and we need you all to be thinking about both of those at the same time? Is that something that you think might make it clearer that it is a both and? There's a now and there's a systems change sort of piece of this, or are we overthinking it and we keep it just, here's the recommendation? Just kind of wanted folks' thoughts on that, being that explicit.
I mean, I think you should be that explicit. I think it's a question of how to make that resonate, right? Like, the ideal way to make it resonate is to get a quote from somebody respected who says, well, smart states can walk and chew gum at the same time and can do what needs to be done today and what needs to be done tomorrow. And it's sort of like an insulting almost, and if you can't, that sort of thing. And then you say, we should do both, right? Like, we should invest today and plan for the long run. I don't know how you do that, but if it is true, but it needs to resonate in a way that makes the case.
Chime in here. I think part of this is we're trying to figure out how to fit this funding design work that we've been doing into this frame of, the need for immediate investment and the sort of short-term asks, which maybe that's actually not the right place to put it, right? Maybe there's sort of a separate conversation about that is more with a different audience, right? Because the audience for that is probably more people who are already invested in this, already interested in building something long-term, because it is sort of a more ongoing process. So that's part of like what we're juggling with this. We've had a few conversations about it.
Yeah, do you think, you need to explicitly say the 2 different pieces of this, the both and kind of idea, because people who are going to be funding a system need to know what you're asking for in the immediate short term, but they also need to understand the implications on the long term. But to Michael's point, you have to weave a narrative about that. But I do think it's important to have both pieces in the document.
Build the confidence that what you're funding short term is building for a strategy that's
right. That there's a broader vision to this whole idea. It's not just throwing money at something, short term to fix some problem that will go away. It's that the need for an investment and a strategy that, will improve the state over the long term. And that this is, because I think a lot of people in the Capitol think of this as, okay, we funded this last year, we don't need to fund it again this year.
Yeah.
Like, they think of it in a very short term, like silo, and there needs to be an understanding that this is a long term investment.
And if we attempt to parallel it to the K-12 work, it doesn't end after 1 year. This is longitudinal.
Yeah, ultimately, we're trying to teach people that school begins at, 8 weeks old. And I mean, that it's a lifeline, and that this is an investment that has to keep going, and that the payoff is partially immediate, but the big payoff is
The next generation.
Yeah, the next generation, long after they're out of office.
it was almost like kind of a roadmap approach of like sort of going.
I mean, I think, yes, and it strikes me that we've done roadmaps before, but I think the thing you wanna try and do is as compact as possible, weave a compelling narrative, so I mean. Maybe I'm just stuck there on the idea of pull out quotes, but it strikes me that a roadmap that has 5 quotes, from different well-respected people saying you invest here, you invest here, you invest here, invest here, invest here. Like, that's the roadmap, is 1 sentence, 2 sentences, but it's all from all people you can't ignore what they are saying. Then I think you start to begin to both show the roadmap and make a compelling narrative around it.
I think it's probably important, again, and I know every time we get a report it shows, but how many kids we're serving and how many kids are unserved. What the need is. You know, if we're gonna talk about how important it is, well, let's see how astounding the need is. I mean, it's almost overwhelming how many unserved kids we have.
Something we talked about earlier in the year, but I don't know if it fits into the economic impact focus, and we still don't know how to visualize it. We talked about that, not understanding what happens in a media-free classroom and thinking it's babysitting, and trying to show somehow what's actually happening in that classroom, whether it's with the schedule and showing the outcomes of the learning activities that are taking place, the short-term, learning outcomes, and then the long-term, how this ties into self-regulation, ability to focus in your plan. Not causing accident, but yeah, but I don't know if that fits in here. Still a really difficult concept, but that is something that we had talked about, that how do we combat this misunderstanding and lack of awareness that learning is it's long.
All those people were doing is talking to kids during the day. Think how important that is. Just talking and communicating and interacting with them. I mean,
Love to provide a 3-day class training for all of our legislators. But what happens there is that's when they begin to understand the true complexity and the importance of those intentional interactions. When you go through that, and I've been asked to do that in other states, because then they get it.
And that you're being measured on all of
Yeah.
those tools, so when you see performance scores increasing each year, that means children who
they
do
don't
have
even know that
access,
exists.
they do. Children who do have access are actually getting that experience.
So I hear what you're saying, Karen, like, I
They
think
don't know.
they don't know, but I don't know how
Right.
we get it
In
as
a
clear
very
as.
comprehensible.
Sure,
event.
in that one narrative, that one quote
Because
is
they're
like,
not gonna take your 3-day.
Absolutely.
You know, it might take you 2 hours.
That's a bill.
bus tour. We've done that before. We've done.
Maddie.
Oh, okay.
I feel like
Do I need a public comment card? I just wanted to add to, I think in terms of like toggling between the short term and long term, like the reality is that like we have a wait list of 6,000 kids who qualify for service, right? So it's like there are literally 3,000-ish parents or more who want to go to work. This is not like we think kids should be in care and we're gonna be the government stepping in and we should put your child in care. This is literally, there's 6,000 kids who are waiting to go to care, which means there's their parents who are waiting to go to work. So that's something that we maybe haven't had in previous reports to really lean into. That maybe we can leverage in a different way now. I think this is my second point, and I'll let y'all continue because this is not this on anyway. But also going back to ROI a little bit, because that is kind of like the short and long term effects. What I feel like what we've been hearing a lot during session is the legislators really wanting to understand how we get to 13%. And even though like a Nobel laureate economist should stand in their own justification, not everyone maybe understands like what goes into all that. And so quantifying these things instead of saying more conceptual might pack a bigger punch as well. Like, what does it cost for juvenile services? What does it cost for mediation and sped services? What does it cost for adult incarceration? And how can we add up these things and say like over the lifespan of the child, if they have these adverse outcomes that we know happen, they don't have access,
or the adverse outcomes that could happen when they don't have access. This is what it costs versus on the front end paying this much now. I don't know if we have the time to do all those that depth of an analysis before September. But just like thinking maybe the next year or something like that, being able to quantify it might be able to be more impactful.
It's easy to get the incarceration thing, what it calls to incarcerated juvenile.
I've also been always a big fan in this report of just keeping the big number in front of policymakers. You know, this is, what is it now, like, we're up to like $1.2 billion is really the need to meet, you know, to meet the full need in Louisiana. And so, you know, they're across the pond right now asking for $24 million, which is very important. But I think if you're a legislator, you need to understand that that's a small down payment on the actual need, and just to kind of keep that long-term goal.
See, I didn't know that thinking myself.
Well, and
I'm
that's,
writing that down.
that's 2/3 of the at-need population, so
Yeah.
it's not even the whole
That's
at-need
only
population,
Yeah.
it's not the whole population.
I guess I just wonder if that number was scary though, it was so scary that it leads to inactivity, because, you know, you see a lot at the Capitol if it's like, oh, we have this $18 billion backlog of road and bridge work, and so then it's just like everybody freezes, cause it's like,
Like
what do you
retirement
do?
is dead. Yeah,
Right.
like, no, I get that, and I just think that somewhere there needs to be the big number, like, this is
like that.
this is the mountaintop. And, you know, we're not asking you to get to the top, we're asking to, you know, you need to kind of start scaling.
Yeah.
Report, so I wonder, you know, I don't know if there's a different way if it is to stay in the report, because it's been in the report every year. I don't know.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I think that was you, Karen. I think my wheels are turning on a couple of slightly new ways to sort of approach this. I did want to ask a question about sort of level of detail, and I just kind of want to get a gut check on this. I heard a couple of ideas that made me go into like a really visual place where, and I think you all know there are lots of different ways to do reports like this. There is the like very heavy visual, sort of think 2-page infographic with minimum text, and then there is the lengthy narrative. We've always come somewhere in the middle, right? Where we've had a number of graphics and we've had a sort of number of big blocks of narrative. I want to sort of take a pulse on, are folks comfortable with the level of narrative we have had, or would you be open to something that is even more visual and does not necessarily bring the explanatory text in, and perhaps that exists elsewhere where we are sending people to other existing sources of information where they can dive deeper in the context. So I'm going to re-ask that question because I talked a lot. Would you be open to something that is highly visual, limited text?
I don't think anyone reads a lot of text. I'm not sure they read anything that gets put on the desk, but,
And we clearly need some sort of executive summary that has some text.
absolutely. Oh, no, absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, I think highly visual with links elsewhere and other details could be fine, and fully agree on executive summary. I mean, I guess I'm wondering whether maybe it's out of scope of what we think here, but we're talking about all the things you would want to fit in, and the real challenge is how to condense it and make a compelling argument. And so on some level, what I think we all agree is you need a compelling executive summary of 1, 2, 3 arguments. But then the sort of through line is, and we also want to say these 14 other things. And so I guess the natural question is, okay, so create a cadence to when you say those 14 other things, right? There's nothing wrong with saying them. You just can't say them all at once, otherwise they don't resonate. And So, you know, you link to and through things, and a month later or 6 weeks later, you drop another thing that has a headline and another thing that has a headline and another. You know, that's not one report as much as it's a report that then links to a bunch of sub-reports, but all of which make the argument you're wanting. So again, that may be well beyond the scope of what we're talking about here, but I think if you were designing a campaign to get things across the finish line, you would blast key messages again and again that all circle back to each other, not put out one report.
Well, the way to do that is to have a report and then an event and then a, you know, to sort of sequence get the people who are quoted in the report to come talk and.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love, and I don't know exactly who was talking, if that was Michael,
me,
but
Michael.
yeah, I love that. I think you summarized the exact challenge that I know we've had every time, which is we do want to say 14 different things. We want to make all these really important, compelling points. And so is there a model by which we do make 3 of them now, and then there is a plan for making the rest of them over time? I think that is kind of, you know, where our brains go, obviously, as comms folks. So it's just something to noodle on, but it is making me think too around, you know, that visual versus text. I want to hear what others think as well about that. I mean, I did hear, you know, executive summary with some amount of detail, but other thoughts too on sort of this tension between trying to get everything in and also not risking putting too little in.
Well, and I wonder, Lauren, if a second question to that is if there are visuals and it's more heavily visual than text, you know, then which visuals you pick become increasingly important as well.
Yes, yeah, that's exactly right, Karen. And I think in my mind, I was actually thinking of ideally one visual that tells the story. So something that, and I don't know what that is yet, but rather than the approach we've taken where we have 3 or 4 distinct separate visuals that are sharing different pieces of data, is there actually a cohesive visual representation of the type of the story we are telling, right? So I was really picturing in my head that idea of, you know, it is a lifespan, you know, it is impacting both people and economy over a period of time. So I was more thinking there is one visual around which everything focuses, and we would then not necessarily have a visual, for example, on the parishes that are part of the ECE fund match or the total number of kids in need graphic. It would be one thing that tells one cohesive story. And those data points would be in there, of course, right? We would want to say this is how many kids are in need. But I was sort of upending our whole approach and thinking, like, is there one picture that gets us to this story? It might just be something to try. You know, it's food for thought, and of course we'll continue to noodle on this. But that was what I was thinking to your point, Karen.
Well, and I think we have attempted that before with that bridge, you know, that sort of
Yes.
final image to the report, but we still haven't gotten there. So we'll try it. And then to Michael's point, I do think the quotes from certain strategic leaders will mean more than just a visual.
I mean, the only visual I've ever seen that mostly encapsulates what we're trying to argue is, and frankly, I'm not sure that the data is valid on this, but there was that visual we produced like 5 years ago that sort of shows a future economic progress or future economic decline. And it's sort of, it's Louisiana crossroads. Here's where we are today. We have a choice. We can invest in kids. It will save us money. It will create economic impact, or we can go down. And, you know, fast forward out 20 years and I think it was something like a $20 billion increase or some not so small, but not as large as you'd expect decrease, like 1.3 or 1.5. Ali, why can't I think of his last name, did that, yeah, did that years ago. So again, I never looked hard at the data because I like what it showed, so, but I think some version of that is the only thing I've ever seen that somewhat encapsulates the argument.
I'd add, I've been kind of debating whether I'm just wrong and I shouldn't say this, but I've come from the university where we're deeply indoctrinated in the idea that, you know, you've got to document your sources, you've got to lay out your methodology, you've got to explain your results carefully, and the word choices of all these things matter. Even if the only thing people look at are an executive summary and a visual. And I like this idea that we work to try to make the big takeaways as impactful and easy to digest as possible. But having something that still backs that up seems like an important thing. So I guess back to the question of the way this report was written in the past, do we still want something that looks kind of like that? I'd be inclined to say yes. That's my thought. And it may just be, again, you know, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of thought already. We're all comfortable with that. But if there's a report that's going to leave this group and to be trusted by others, I think we need the backup. You know, it doesn't have to be super lengthy and super detailed, but to the skeptic who says, you know, is that Louisiana data? You know, if somebody can just thumb through and the word Louisiana shows up a bunch of times and there's, you know, parentheses that show a citation to the American Community Survey or whatever, right? Like just that there's something that somebody, even if they're not going to read it word by word, that they can thumb through and have some assurance that, oh no, this was really well thought out. There's good data backing this up. That's.
You know, every day we get a report or two or three or four on our desk from every agency that's their day at the Capitol. And I think some of the ones that are really effective are the ones that, and you were talking about the quotes in blocks, but some of the ones that put the statistics in blocks, numbers in blocks, like you were talking about, just like a number, like a percentage. So I don't know how you might incorporate some of your most important data into something like that. And then in the small print, you can get the detail, if you're interested.
Yeah.
But just kind of not stunning people, but causing that focus to be on these numbers or these blocks that are, you know, a certain color that really catch your eye.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that, but I think to have those mixed into or at the front end of a larger document where people can thumb through and at least see as much as they want to see. Yeah,
Yeah, I would agree with that. I guess my only push would be, I think we've traditionally thought of the long thing with all the documents as the report, and then we sort of created an executive summary design. I think there absolutely ought to be the validation of the data. We ought to know what we're saying. But I think what I would argue is the thing you probably want to put forward is the summary, the impactful thing, and like you have to click the link to find all the documentation. It all ought to be there. But I think, you know, it's a 20-page report. People will look at page 1 and 2, and maybe that's your executive summary. I think ideally what you want to do is say, this is 2 pages, this is 1 page, here's the argument, go do. And then, yeah, click the link at the bottom, and it's got the 75 pages of backup.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I think figuring out the right, I'm hearing that it is still a both and then a matter of like which thing is the high visual, whether that's an exec summary or that's a pull-out sheet within a longer report. It is important that we offer, I think what I'm hearing is it is important that we offer both, because people are different kinds of learners and they are maybe seeking different types of information. So something very visual is great for certain audiences, and something with more of those details and citations is also important. So it is a matter of how do we meet the diverse needs of our audience in terms of what they can engage with. Is that summarizing accurately?
I think so. And actually, I think I think the vast majority of people who will look at any of this will look only at the abbreviated summary major takeaways, even if the report itself has block quotes in large font, they might thumb through and only read the block quotes or the visual, visualizations that have a big number in bold print, right? But to have and it might only be 15 pages, that to have the longer form thing in their hands, I think makes people more prepared to absorb the 5 bullets that we want them to absorb from the executive summary. I don't know.
Okay.
I think it gives the reader an immediate level of trust that there was a lot of thought that went into this.
Yeah, got it.
Because I know, how long was the last
It's
one?
been very short,
Like
the
8
last,
pages?
Yeah.
the first one I think maybe was closer to 20 pages, but the last few years, last year it might have been 7 pages. I mean, it's gone to 12, it's gone to 7, knowing that people are not reading it.
Yeah.
Yeah, excluding the cover page and the page of the list of members, it was only 4 pages of content in March. And that was with this year, remember we did photography too. So there's actually some photos in as well as the visual. So it was pretty concise. I mean, that was really intentional, on all of our parts for this exact reason. And I mean, it still had, citations and whatnot, but I think this is helpful in just thinking about, getting to the sweet spot, and how to really weave in the right level of detail, utilize the other resources that are available to us in terms of, it's not like this is the only group that has information on early care and education in Louisiana. So, being able to cite out and refer out to other resources with critical detail is helpful. So I think this has been very, very productive, at least on our end. So thank you. I know we have a similar conversation every year, but it really does help. Things do change over time. And I think to some degree, the specific emphasis in a given legislative session changes. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, how we distribute this report. The one in March, it's put on our desk.
Well, so originally it went, I think 30 days before session started, so it went in February, and I guess it was put on your desk. I'm not really sure how it was distributed. And then the idea behind this one was to get it in place before those budgets were being proposed.
So those would be sent to every legislator's home office, is that would be?
I think that's a good question.
Because
We have to
I can
figure out.
tell you, when you get 5 reports on your desk in the House, you're probably not gonna read them. I'm trying to think this session, how many early childhood things have been on my desk? At least 4 or 5. And not from different organizations, but a lot of information. And people tend not to read all of that because it just gets stacked up and you've got at least 5 a day, and
Right.
It's overwhelming, and you're worried about what you're presenting on the floor. So if it went to their home address or to their office, I think it might stand a better chance of getting read. I don't know. I'm just thinking.
To the points that Ruby made earlier about like the storytelling and also the relationship building pieces of this, like I think it might be asking a little bit too much of a document to be like, it will stand out from the pile of 5 reports on your desk and people will read it on its own, right? But if it gets picked up in the media, if people are using it to start conversations, like thinking about how it's used kind of interpersonally might be like more the strategy rather than like the report will stand on its own without any of that additional.
Well, that's what the legislature was intended to get something in the fall so that budget planning would be. Yeah, I do too.
I think we're at the end. I think the final thing is the opposite of a 7-page report is a 173 required by the federal government report that is in draft form. We'll be having a public hearing for it at the end of this month, just sharing that as an FYI. And then lastly, this group will meet again July 23rd in this room.
Will that be, will you be able to Zoom that meeting?
The July 23rd. I mean, we'll have it live streaming just like this, yes.
So
Yes.
I could,
Yes, and you're welcome to attend again in person as well, we'll be, and
I think I'm gonna be out of state.
okay, got it. Got it, we'll be in touch regarding the commission meeting right now, presently scheduled for June 10th, but we're being cognizant of, additional legislation being brought forward and want to make sure those vacancies are filled in advance of the next meeting. Thank you for your time, I appreciate your discussion, and helping inform the future work of the commission.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you.